Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and happy Jane Austen July! So since Jane Austen July is unfortunately rapidly drawing to a close, I thought I would share with you all my Jane Austen collection of books either by or about Jane Austen. Now, I've been a fan of Jane Austen's work since I was 12 years old, so in the almost 17 years since then, I've gathered a lot of books on the topic. So these videos will probably come out in different installments. So the first installment will be my non-fiction books. These are books either about Jane Austen, her writing, or about the Regency era in which she lived. So my first non-fiction books are my annotated editions of Austen's novels. These are a series of annotated novels by Belknap from the Harvard University Press, each with different scholarly contributors. Each book contains the full novel, but with footnotes filling in different facts about historical context, double meanings, elucidations on Austen's style, Regency writing and spelling habits, etc. So far, I own Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Northanger Abbey. Mansfield Park and Persuasion have also been published, I just don't own them yet. Behind Closed Doors by Amanda Vickery. Amanda Vickery is an amazing scholar and goes into incredible detail about daily life in Georgian England. This book was described to me by my mentor at the Jane Austen Center as the seminal piece on Georgian history, and it truly is. This book is also a signed edition that I discovered secondhand. A Dance with Jane Austen, Celebrating Pride and Prejudice, and Jane and I, all by Susanna Fullerton. A Dance with Jane Austen covers dancing rituals and the importance of dancing in Jane Austen's work. Celebrating Pride and Prejudice is exactly that, literary criticism that lovingly commemorates Pride and Prejudice's 200th anniversary. And Jane and I is a memoir that chronicles Fullerton's love of reading and her love of Austen's novels over the years. I was lucky enough to meet Susanna Fullerton at the 2016 JASNA AGM, and she is as thoroughly lovely as she is a wonderful scholar. Regency Etiquette, or the Mirror of Graces, is a real ladies' deportment guide published in 1811. It gives you a glimpse of how young Regency women were expected to dress and behave by society at large. It's difficult to find these days, but if you can find a copy, it is a fascinating read. In Her Own Hand, compiled by Catherine Sutherland. In Her Own Hand is 3 volumes of facsimiles of Austen's juvenilia and unpublished works. In the back, there's a transcribed version, in case Austen's handwriting is too difficult to read. I own the juvenilia in other forms as well, but the fact that I can see them as Jane Austen originally wrote them is extra special. The World of Jane Austen by Nigel Nicholson contains beautiful photos of the places that Austen lived or visited during her lifetime. All Things Austen is a 2-volume encyclopedia of Austen's work and world. This is a particularly special library cast-off, as I used it back in 2006 as a reference for my first high school research paper on Pride and Prejudice. The Oxford Illustrated Dictionary of 19th Century Language is exactly what it sounds like. It defines words that either had a different meaning in the 19th century or are now unused, and gives an example from a 19th century novel. The Jane Austen Cookbook by Maggie Black and Deirdre LaFay. The recipes in here are sourced from Austen's friend Martha Lloyd's recipes. This cookbook will be an excellent reference book for me, but due to my many food allergies, I will probably never be able to try many of the recipes myself. Sense and Sensibility, the Screenplay and Diaries by Emma Thompson. This book was a magical find for me. It contains not only Emma Thompson's final screenplay for the 1995 film, but it also contains her diaries from the filming, which are both hilarious and insightful. As If, The Oral History of Clueless by Jen Chaney. Yes, this belongs in my Jane Austen collection. As the film is an adaptation of Emma, I was intrigued to read these interviews with everyone who was involved in the making of Clueless. It was a fun read, just like the film itself. Jane Austen's Women by Kathleen Anderson. My Jasna region was lucky enough to host Kathleen Anderson for a talk this past fall. In this book, she looks at Austen's perspective on women's relationships with the world, such as women and the body, women and society, and women and the mind. Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. A wonderful biography of Jane, covering her family as a whole, Regency England, and Austen's place among it all. Lucy Worsley can do no wrong in my book, and this work is one of her best. The Genius of Jane Austen and The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things, both by Paula Byrne. The Genius of Jane Austen explores Austen's relationship to the theater, both her theatrical influences and how her own work is transferred to theater or film. The Real Jane Austen looks at everyday objects, many of which are still in Chawton House Museum, and uses them as a touch point to explore a moment or a theme in Austen's life. Paula Byrne is another of my favorite Jane Austen scholars, and happens to be married to one of my favorite Shakespeare scholars, Jonathan Bate. I highly recommend both these books. Jane Austen, The Secret Radical by Helena Kelly. This book looks at ways in which Austen's novels could be seen to be secretly subversive. I know this book has gotten a lot of criticism, and Kelly does sometimes make unfounded or improbable leaps, but it holds a special place in my heart, as Helena Kelly taught my Jane Austen course when I studied in Bath during my undergraduate years. What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen. This book is another of the great works of Austenian scholarship. Mullen looks at 20 seemingly tiny things in Austen's work and points out what huge importance they actually hold. If you can, try to watch any talks that Mullen gives. His enthusiasm is joyfully contagious. A Truth Universally Acknowledged is a collection of essays by authors about why they love Jane Austen. It contains essays from writers like C.S. Lewis and Virginia Woolf, all the way to Susanna Clarke and Amy Heckerling. All are wonderful, but Amy Heckerling's was my particular favorite. Jane's Fame by Claire Harmon looks into how Austen's work gained popularity after spending so many years in relative anonymity. Jane Austen, A Life by Claire Tomalin is considered the keystone biography of Austen, so of course I needed to read it. Jane Austen, The World of Her Novels by Deirdre LaFay is both biography and literary criticism, containing beautiful full-color illustrations and photographs to illustrate historical points. Jane Austen's Letters, edited by Deirdre LaFay, is the definitive collection of Austen's surviving letters. There are newer editions available now, but this one is special to me, as it is a cast-off from the Jane Austen Center staff library from my time as an intern there. The Illustrated Letters is a selection of letters from the full collection, but contains beautiful photos and historical drawings of things or places mentioned in the letters, such as this bookshop in London. Jane Austen's The History of England is a facsimile edition of Austen's young satire of history books, complete with her sister Cassandra's illustrations. Two Histories of England begins with Austen's same text, minus the illustrations, then compares it with Charles Dickens' A Child's History of England. Praying with Jane Austen by Rachel Dodge. Rachel Dodge creates an Austenian devotional guide here by taking text from 3 prayers that Jane Austen wrote during her lifetime and pairing it with a piece of scripture. She then uses her study of both quotations to lead into an invitation to prayer, a full prayer, and/or allows the reader to create a prayer of their own. I used this guide to begin scripture journaling last year, and it's a lovely tool for any Janeite who wishes to deepen their faith. Tea with Jane Austen by Pen Vogler. This book is a collection of recipes inspired by Austen's life and work. Some are historical recipes, others are just traditional tea-time treats. I have a better chance of making some of these with allergy-friendly replacement baking ingredients, so I'll let you know if I try one. The Jane Austen Quiz Book by Helen Barton. I bought this book on my first visit to the Jane Austen Center in 2009, and the quizzes are still quite fun and challenging. The Bedside, Bathtub, and Armchair Companion to Jane Austen by Carol Adams, Douglas Buchanan, and Kelly Gesh. I bought this book at Chawton House Museum during my studies in 2011, and it is still such fun. It's full of essays, interviews with authors, and puzzles and quizzes to keep your Janeite brain curious and entertained. What Jane Austen Ate and Charles Dickens Knew by Daniel Poole. This was my first 19th century reference book, and it is still a staple in my opinion. Poole covers all the basics of the 19th century, from birth to death and everything in between. Jane Austen's Guide to Dating by Lauren Henderson. This book is not as frivolous as it sounds, because Austen's character studies are spot on. Henderson analyzes all of the lessons about dating that one can draw from Austen's novels, such as avoid toxic flirts and trust your own instincts. There's also a fun quiz at the back to tell you which Jane Austen character you're most like, what you should look for in a relationship, and which character your partner or crush is most like. Jane Austen's Guide to Good Manners by Josephine Ross. Written in a Regency-esque style, this book is a survival guide of how to behave and how not to behave in Regency society, full of beautiful illustrations by Henrietta Webb. The Jane Austen Handbook by Margaret C. Sullivan. Margaret C. Sullivan is one of the funniest Janeite authors I've read. She is able to simultaneously riff on Caroline Bingley in How to Become an Accomplished Lady, and give a detailed description of societal ranking in Field Guide to the Social Order. This book is fun and instructional, and I highly recommend it. All Roads Lead to Austen by Amy Elizabeth Smith. Smith is a university professor who conducted a year-long trip through Central and South America, holding Austen book groups. She was curious to see if readers still formed very strong connections with the characters, or if their perspectives on the novel's situations changed due to either cultural or translation differences. It was a fun and fascinating read for me, since I was an English literature and Spanish linguistics major in my undergraduate years. An Elegant Madness by Venetia Murray. This book is a glimpse into high Regency society, like the Prince Regent, Lord Byron, and Caroline Lamb. Austen wouldn't have participated in any of these events herself, but she certainly would have been hearing about them in the news, and I'm sure using them as satirical fodder. Lastly is a fun little stocking stuffer book, What Would Jane Do?, which pulls quotations from her novels and her letters to provide you with fun, useful life advice. And that's all for today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next installments. And until then, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye, everyone.